Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 250 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we need to work on our ore crystalizers and get them set up for our new ores. And luckily, we're going to be able to make this a lot smaller than this, not only because we're going to have tier 2 crystalizers and modules, but we're also going to have the recipe combinator mod, which will make that a lot cleaner. And we'll need to update our logic in a bit. But before we start talking about that, we probably want to get some research going, because the next step of our ore bus is processing all of these ores. We are already processing them, but we're going to have access to higher tiers of processing, so a lot of this is going to get rebuilt anyway. The general build of it is going to be similar, and it's going to be smaller because of better machines, but it's going to be more complicated. And I don't know exactly how long that research is going to take, so we should probably start it now. And there's many different things we're going to need to research, so we might as well get it going. And kind of one thing that we do need to do is work on better forms of concrete and cement. And it's kind of a complicated process. Right now, we need to make the cement, so we make it with silicon and lime. So half of that is unlimited and half of it isn't. The silicon is the part we need to create, and lime is free. And then we add slag and water to make the concrete, and then it goes from there. And right now we're making regular concrete, but the factory is now completely covered in regular concrete, so we might as well start making refined concrete and maybe use some bots to make that easier. It would still be a lot of work. But at this point they're covering quite a bit of space, so they could do a lot of the work for us. And maybe this will be the final kick from behind in order to get the logistics zone covering everywhere, so all the bots can handle this and we don't have to anymore. One reason why I haven't been messing with refined concrete is because it just requires more resources. That 20 concrete go in, but only 10 come out. Plus it requires iron and steel. So as far as your input requirements, it's a lot worse. And it's really not that much better. You only get 10% extra walking speed, so it's not like an insane difference, especially considering we fly these days. But it does look a little nicer than this. There'll be less weeds, so it would probably be worth doing. But regardless, we are going to need to do this extra process in order to get reinforced concrete bricks, which we don't need right now, but we will need it for the next tiers of machines. And these bricks themselves are pretty straightforward. It's just stone bricks, concrete, and you add steel to it. It's just the question is where does that concrete come from? And this method does unlock the next tier of each. So instead of a silicon and a lime going in to make one cement, it's an alumina, an iron, a silicon, and a lime to make 2 cement. So as far as raw resources go, it's still twice as much goes in as what you get. But at least this will spread the load around a little bit, so instead of just all requiring silicon, it will be a little bit of aluminum and a little bit of iron as well. And then the concrete recipe is what's interesting, because previously it was 8 cement to get 100 concrete and we need to add some slag. But now it's 6 cement to make 120 concrete. So it's more efficient when it comes to the cement doing it this way. Not to mention that it doesn't actually require slag anymore. It just requires stone. So before we had to save slag to make concrete out of it, but now we can make it out of anything. It doesn't have to be slag anymore, which will be useful because I think that was the only thing we were actually saving the slag for in the first place, was to, go into this warehouse in order to make the concrete. And we also were saving it for crushing purposes, but seems like we haven't needed it. I was laying some concrete down, so the stone is empty again. We may want to have this have a higher buffer than just 10,000, it seems like. Because it doesn't have to run very long before it gets completely emptied. But I think it might have been set that way because of other logic that was attached to it. But it's not like the factory's completely clogged right now. Everything is still running fine. But I think the numbers that it runs on were right here. Yeah, that it has to be at least 20,000. Well, in that situation, it might make sense just to let it fill up all the way, because the reason why there's logic on here in the first place is to give these systems an extra place to send their crushed stone, because they produce way more than 6 belts of crushed stone. But it does have a splitter here, so in the event that it can't put it on this bus, it would just send it up here anyway, so it might be entirely unnecessary to have this. But we don't want it going over 80,000 because then the dump systems will engage, and I'm not sure if we want that to happen. This is all kind of tacked on after the fact here, so it's a little weird. Let's do like 70 to give it a better buffer. But with that better concrete, we won't need to keep slag anymore. We can double check that slag has no other uses that we would need to save it for. And looks like no. Concrete and slag slurry and crushed stone, so those are all of the outputs. That would make the factory a little less complicated. And you do have to add some wash sand in there, but that's no big deal. That's something that you can easily make. So seems good. We don't necessarily need to work on this right now, but it is kind of relevant, so we probably should do it fairly soon, because making all that refined concrete is going to take a long time. So we probably want to get that process started. And from here we can just go through these resources. I guess we can start with iron. So what you unlock with the third tier of processing here is you go from a processed ore to the pellet version of the ore. And then usually there's a extra requirement, so instead of just coke, it now requires coke and limestone. But then you get 24 ingots out of 8 pellets. So it's kind of a long process to follow here. We can just research this for now. It's probably going to go fairly quickly, but I guess that's good. We can use Hellmod to calculate this out because it's a little weird how it works, because it's not even numbers. So you can see how we have our 3 tiers. To make iron ingots from iron, it's just 1-to-1 ratio with no input. And then you add 2 coke for tier 2, and then the 2 coke and the 2 limestone for tier 3. So if we do tier 3, and let's say our intended output is 30, we need to make the iron pellets, which are made in this pellet press, and then we need to make the processed iron. That it's basically a 100% increase, so that it goes from 15 to 30. If we wanted to do it the way we're currently doing it, and we wanted 30, the processed ore would go in, and it would require 20. So doing this isn't quite as big of an improvement. The first time it went from 30 in to 20 in, and now this next one is from 20 to 15, so it's not quite as big of an improvement, but still, that's a 100% efficiency increase from the base ore to do it this way. So when you consider all of the other productivity related things in the factory, that it really starts to add up fast. And that applies to all of the processing methods. So the processed version of something gives you that first buff to get it from 30 to 20, and then going from pellets gets it from 20 to 15. And looks like we're almost done researching. But that's how that goes. And we'll also have access to better ingot methods here. But for now, we'll just get the standard iron ingots. And we might as well hit the manganese one here. And I guess we'll need to do tier 2 first here. Aren't we processing manganese, or is it just going straight through? Or is that something that got changed with the update? No, we aren't doing any processing methods for manganese right now. So the idea is the same. Just goes into the ore processor and turns into processed version, and this is one of them that uses cathodes. So it's a good dump for our acid, where you dump the sulfuric acid in, you make the cathodes, and then those cathodes become the ingots. So that'll be that tier. And then we get another one. I think I probably would have researched that at some point. I'm not sure why I didn't. Something tells me that the tech requirement on it changed, but I could have also just not done it at the time. But so that will create the pellets there. And then we have an extra step of adding natural gas, so we'll have to mine that from somewhere or bring it down there. We'll have to see how much it actually ends up being. It might end up being a lot, where that's not really appropriate for drones, but we're not building these quite yet. We just want to get the research done, so when we do start building it, we don't just have to sit and wait for it to all research. And to make the cathodes, we add in the sulfuric acid like before, but we also add in some iron ingots, which is interesting, creating the iron hydroxide, and then that can be turned back into the iron ingots with some coke. So it doesn't actually consume iron, it just goes in a circle, which is similar to how some other processes worked here, like to make zinc, how we need to use lead. It's a closed loop system going in a circle, so it's kind of like that. just with an extra step. And that research is pretty fast. Maybe this was unnecessary. Well, we can hit copper here then. So you make the pellets, and now copper, with the addition of oxygen gas, will create an anode, and then you add the sulfuric acid to get the ingots out of it. And I guess we'll just research them in a row here. So now we need lead and tin. Lead, you make the pellets, and to make the anodes, you need limestone, coke, oxygen gas, and it will create the sulfur, which is something that it has done before. And then to make the ingots, we need those anodes and the hexafluorosilicic acid. And interestingly, it will create a slag. But that acid is hydrofluoric acid with silicon added to it. And it will disappear, so this will consume some silicon to make that happen, but it's probably worth it. And then for tin, we make the pellets, and it's pretty easy. You add carbon. So then we have our nickel and silicon methods here, and that will fill up the tree for now. And interestingly, that's a purple research, so nickel will have to wait, and the silicon pellets as well will have to wait. Let's see if we have silver or zinc. Silver, yes. We can now do the tier 2 of processing it. So it turns into processed silver, and we add nitric acid to it to get silver nitrate, then that gets turned into silver. And we got our zinc, which this is the processed version of it because it's got no previous tier here. So we turn it into processed zinc, carbon and oxygen. It gets sulfur dioxide gas, and also opens up zinc powder if we would need that for the paste. And those are researching, so I guess we'll just let those go for however long they take. Seems like it's not taking too long, but at least something's happening now. So let's talk about all these crystallizers that we have, these 3 different methods available, and then logic to determine basically which one is the lowest. So all of the signals are going in, and it's getting processed through all of this, and I've already done an episode covering this, so I kind of don't want to go through it again, but basically it's just splitting the signals apart, figuring out which resource we have the least of, and then putting that on this wire. So that's either silicon or silver. I think that is actually silicon. So if we come up here, is silicon the one that is the lowest? And it is. You can also see it with the circuit HUD here. Those other ones aren't being calculated yet, but basically it's just saying silicon is the lowest, so if you're going to process any sludge, process it from silicon. But now we have some more methods available to us, because previously we just had a choice between iron and copper, lead and tin, or silicon and silver, but now we've got an extra 5 choices here. We've got gold and nickel, which is a good choice. There's nothing wrong with it. And we have zinc and titanium, which is also a good choice. But these last 3 are kind of weird. So in the case of aluminum, we would get manganese and chrome. Those are actually pretty good outputs. Aluminum is just a base ore being used for things, but manganese and chrome are basically byproduct ores that just go into making other ores more efficiently. So if we had manganese ore, we would turn it into ingots. Then those ingots could be placed in titanium, aluminum, iron, or steel to reduce the input requirements. Chrome is similar, where we have our chrome ingots, and then those can get placed in these high-tech alloys here with 3 inputs. So for example, with titanium, if we mixed chrome and cobalt to it, we would only have to have 1/3 of it actually be titanium going in. And that one's kind of expensive because it requires cobalt, and that's also kind of a rare resource. But iron is a pretty good one here, where 12 iron and then 12 chrome and also 12 nickel. And nickel is kind of a byproduct we tend to have a lot of right here. That's a great way of getting rid of nickel. Would make some iron there, and steel is also a fairly good way, but it does require tungsten, which is kind of difficult. So you see that chrome doesn't go into that many things, and it's essentially a byproduct. But we could potentially use it, but the problem is we can't use it right now, because we can research the ability to make the ingots, but strangely enough, maybe it's an oversight or maybe it's kind of a new ore that was added in, but we need purple science to actually do anything with it. Because you see, to make that iron casting 4, that we would need to have purple science. So it's kind of a trap right now to make any of that stuff. And this factory has been closed loop for a while now, especially the ore bus section, and I really want that to continue. So I don't like the idea of using this method to make aluminum and manganese, and then have a little bit of chrome just chilling out, because eventually it's going to get overloaded, and then what? Now we have a warehouse full of chrome that we can't do anything with. And the same kind of applies for cobalt here as well. That this is actually a really good method because cobalt and tungsten are fairly rare, so this is a good method to use. But right now we can't do anything with tungsten. That even the first tier of it, which is called advanced tungsten, there's no basic version, and it has all of these steps to make the plates. It's a purple science, and it's definitely a high level resource. So for the same reason as chrome, there's really no reason to make it. I mean, we could, but then it's gonna get filled up because it goes at the same rate as cobalt, where, you know, 40% goes to cobalt and 40% goes to titanium. Then if we create a warehouse full of cobalt, we're gonna create a warehouse full of tungsten, and then nothing. So that's kind of a annoying method right now. So we probably want to skip that one as well. And then we have this. It's reasonably useful. Uranium is a byproduct right now that we're not really going to use because we only have 400 of it. So we're not going to actively create it because we create it so slowly. This is a better way, but it also creates fluorite, and it's fluorite ore, not like an acid byproduct. So if we don't need the fluorite, this isn't going to get very far. And you see that we have 42,000 of it already, and we tend to have a lot of it in general. So this isn't the greatest way of processing sludge, and still the same problem as everything else, is it will create a little bit of thorium. At least it's only 0.5% of thorium. But this is fairly late game, where it requires the gold science as well to get to the thorium power. That's like 2 tiers of nuclear power above the first one. So that's kind of in the future, and I don't want to be creating resources that we just have to hang on to and do nothing with. So we do have some new methods, basically gold and nickel and zinc and titanium, to add to the other 3. So now we need to have 5. So basically this whole setup needs to be expanded to do 5 instead of 3. And I think I would rather kind of build this by hand. We kind of don't need these power poles. Well, they are kind of used as well, so I don't want to copy it and then have all the wires go into wrong spots. So we should probably just build as identical of a copy as is possible. Well, I guess in the process of seeing this get set up, man, that's a lot of wires. Can understand how it works. Well, I was figuring is like we can make it a little cleaner by having a substation in here. That might help. Still some poles being used here, but that might help a little bit. I don't want to tear too much of it apart since it's basically working right now. But the first step here is taking the input signal, which is all of the ores, and only grabbing the signal of the thing that we want to process. So our next 2 methods are gold, nickel, and zinc and titanium. So we'll just copy this over. So that needs to be gold. This one is nickel, zinc, and titanium. I'm not sure why I did the +10, probably to help it jitter less is my guess. But since it was there before, we'll leave them now. So now if you look at the output, each one of these is only outputting the signal that it needs to actually calculate. So the next step here is to make sure that they're under 80,000, because if they're over 80, we don't want it to be included in this calculation. And the reason is because each one of these methods creates 2 resources. So if we wanted to make lead, but we are overloaded on tin, it doesn't matter how low lead is, it's overloaded on tin, so we can't make lead. That's essentially what this does. And it's kind of the same thing, where we just have the signal that we pulled off and then doing the check. So now we have our 4 signals being output because all of them are below 80,000. So everything goes forward. Probably should unhook the output to this to make sure that a lot of pointless processing does not happen. But now the next step here is it's looking at every signal and saying, is it more than the one I'm calculating? If so, add 1 for every one that is over. So basically it's just calculating to see which one is the smallest signal. So right now, the tin here is the biggest signal at 68,000, so it outputs nothing because nothing is smaller than it. And then it goes down the list. Like iron is the next biggest one, so it has an output of 1. Silver is the next biggest one, so it has an output of 2. So now we need to do the same thing but with more ores. So this is checking gold. This one is checking nickel, the zinc, and the titanium. So this works by having all of the signals combined into one. And they're on this red wire here. So we got to connect all those in there. Of course, this is all going to get confused now. Although, let's see. Does it still have a good output? I don't think so. So that's all of the inputs. Then they need to kind of go across here. So now we look at the numbers. And now they make a little more sense, where the biggest signal here is nickel. So it has no output because no other signal is bigger than it. And then we get a 1 for tin here because it's now the second biggest. And then of these signals, second to the bottom is gold, which has 8 signals that are bigger than it. And the bottom is titanium, which has 9 signals bigger than it. So in other words, everybody else. And then the next step here is essentially counting how many signals there actually are. So it just takes every given signal, divides it by itself, which will give us 1C, and puts it on a different wire to basically tell us the number of signals. So this right here is our output. So let's run them all together, and then they go in. So we need a couple more in here to do the same thing with each ore type and get it hooked up the exact same way, which was something like this. And then the input looks like it was kind of swung over here to the other side. That's why it looks kind of weird and messy. So you put that there. Then we can swing the input like that. So now you see that there's basically 1C for each one of these because it's saying that there's a signal. So we have one signal for each. It has an output which is going on this one. So after all of that calculation, we have our necessary signals, where we have the count for the total number of ore signals. One of the signals is 0 because the biggest signal has no signal that is bigger than it, which in this case is nickel. So it's not on the list, but it's there. It's just air quotes 0. So the count kind of takes that into account. So we have a count of 10 total signals, and then the 9 that get a signal are ordered in the highest priority or the lowest amount we have to the lowest priority or the highest amount that we have. And all of these signals are below 80,000, so there's something that we can process right now. It looks like we don't need to keep that going because this right here kind of already does the job for us. And then the next step here is making sure that the ore signal is lower than the count, and if so, output it. That I believe part of this is in place for ties and things like that where the signals get weird. This is just to smooth it out. So same thing as before. Get those taken care of, and then our processing wire comes through. So we go across there. And we don't get an output for nickel because it's the highest, but it's technically still there. Just imagine it that it is 0. And then the outputs now order everything in their priority of highest to lowest. So we'll continue the wire there. And there it is. So not much different from up here. Just the count was removed. But that's kind of like an error checker to make sure nothing's wrong. And now that it's at this point, we know that the count is legit and there's nothing wrong. And we're doing an everything check here to see which number is greater than or equal to everything else. If so, just output that signal. So keep going down the line here of changing all these. That at least as far as this is designed, unfortunately, it requires that everything be set individually. But I think I did definitely try to have eaches and anythings and that sort of thing here, but it just didn't work out, at least with the way that this logic's set up. And I'm not the greatest when it comes to these kind of really complicated things, so I'm sure there's a better way of doing it. But there's the input, and you can see only one of these is actually outputting anything at all. it's titanium, because titanium, of all these signals, is the only one that's greater than everybody else. So we connect it in there again, and now titanium is on the wire. There's one final set of error checking here to make sure that everything is good. And now that it is, these combinators just say, hey, is our signal here? If so, output what we want the output to be. So basically, if silicon signal exists, then make the silicon the output. And we want to do something similar to this, but in a slightly different way. And the different way is because we want to use the recipe combinator, that we don't want to output just an OR anymore. We actually want to output the recipe to make it itself. So we'll say, if a gold OR exists, multiply it by 1, and then the output, looks like we're done with the research there. Now we finally want to come into the crafting combinator recipes here, and we want to do the recipe we would turn on, which is mineral sludge into gold and nickel. And that's what the output is. And let's just get these other ones taken care of, and then we can do some more research. So this one would be nickel. We got to make sure we select the right thing. So the nickel signal is multiplied by 1. And then the output is also that same recipe there. So we kind of do the same thing with everything else. Zinc. If so, the zinc sludge recipe. And I guess we can copy this over to save us doing the recipe again, because then we can just come over here and say titanium. And we got to get these other ones configured as well here. So there we go. Let's just hook them up again. So now our output signal is just the recipe that needs to turn on. So when before, all of this was calculating to determine which signal is the lowest and doesn't have anything turning it off, we'll turn that one on and send one of those signals down. We're kind of doing the same thing, but now it's coming through and sending the recipe as a signal, which is kind of why we've been dealing with having these recipes as signals, is for the purpose of this mod to be able to send recipes on a wire. So now it's telling that any connected machine to run this recipe, and that is how we're going to get it set up to work with the crafting combinator. But we finished up some research here. What was the last thing we were looking at? I think we did zinc. So now we needed to do aluminum. And the tier 2 is purple research. So we can't do any of that. And that's all the stuff that we have now. So now it's the new resources. We already did the uranium. So let's do titanium. And it doesn't have an ingot stage, it appears. Which is interesting because, like, cobalt does, but whatever. It's kind of a long process here. Titanium, carbon, and chlorine go in to get titanium tetrachloride on the way out. And then that gets turned into a titanium sponge. And then that sponge becomes ingots. The ingots to molten titanium to regular. So it kind of combined the research of the ingot stage and the smelting stage into one here. But that's our titanium. And now we need cobalt, which is split into the 2 stages. So cobalt and carbon go in to give us our ingots. Or we can make cobalt oxide by adding cobalt and limestone together. Or we can make the cobalt powder. And out of curiosity, what does cobalt oxide go into? Besides the tier 2 of cobalt ingots, basically lithium. So that is something that'll be necessary for later. Because really, we would need that cobalt oxide and some lithium to make lithium cobalt oxide, and then we're basically making lithium ion batteries, which would be really nice to have. And the other thing we need is gold. And it looks like we already had it researched, because it was an input requirement for advanced electronics, but in a very weird way, since you don't actually use gold for that stage, that I think you used to, and they changed it. But chlorine and gold go in to make the ingots, and then you turn it into molten gold, and the gold plates. And one thing we'll be doing is making the gold copper wires, but we've already got it researched. So that's all of the stages of the ingots. Now we can go through all of the stages of the coils. And that's what all these casting stages are for. So iron is locked behind cobalt here, but this gives us a 4th way of making iron, and that's adding the nickel and the cobalt. We probably won't do too much of this because cobalt is fairly rare at this point, but we'll have logic set up anyway, so if we're ever overloaded on either nickel or cobalt, it can get dumped into iron, so the sorting can continue. But the big difference is the next tier of making sheet coils, that now, instead of using just water to make them, we're going to have to use coolant. But it's a pretty good deal, because if you remember, a sheet coil has 4 plates in it. So whenever you have a coil, you chop it up, you get 4, assuming there's no productivity modules, you get 4 items out, so it's 4 times as dense. Well, 10 of a molten iron creates 1 molten plate. So that would be 160 input to get those 4, and if you look at the previous tier, that's essentially what it is. So if you multiplied this times 2, it would be 160 iron go in with some water, and you get 4 coils on the way out. Well, now we're basically getting 2 free plates out of this, or maybe half of a free coil by doing it. So before, we did the coils to make them easier to ship and to allow productivity modules to chop them up. Well, now we actually get a performance increase by using coolant. We haven't used coolant up until this point, but you see that 40 go in, and then we get 40 used coolant on the way out at 300 degrees. And where is the coolant at? All the way up here. We haven't used it for much of anything. I did have the option of turning steam into purified water if that's something you'd want, and it's not the worst thing in the world if you actually need purified water nearby. But the coolant chain is as follows. It's a fairly easy thing to make. It's yet more mineral oil that we're going to have to use, so we're probably going to be really lacking on the stuff until we build like a fish setup to make a bunch of oil without making the other byproducts. But considering most of it is just water, that you actually get a lot of coolant for not that much input oil. And then depending on how hot the coolant is, it has to go through multiple series of cooling towers. So if we had 300 degree coolant, we would have to use all 3 tiers. So you add water, add the coolant, you get all of the coolant back, and you get some steam. In this case, it's 175 degrees. And then you do the same thing for 200 degree stuff to get 150 degree steam. And finally, the 100 degree stuff, which I'm not terribly sure how the steam is hotter than what went in. But you get 125 degree steam on the way out. And now finally, the coolant has been cooled down into the temperature you can use it again. I believe 175 is the optimal temperature for tier 1 steam power production. But nonetheless, you can kind of hook all these together and just create energy from the steam that you have, whatever it so happens to create, and that will make that go away. I mean, you could also just vent the steam, I suppose, but it's free electricity, so we might as well use it if we can. But in the end, we're going to have used coolant, and if we use coal filters, we can clean the used coolant back into regular. But you see, we lose a little bit of it. 200 go in, but only 160 come out, so we'll have to be replaced. But because most of it is just water to begin with, that we're really not going to have that big of a mineral oil input for all of this. But we'll still have to calculate it by Helmod to find out, because it's possible with every one of these setups doing this that the mineral oil requirement might be rather high. And later, when we have the purple science, we'll be able to use ceramic filters for this. Still loses the same amount of coolant though, so it's not that big of a difference. But that's how we make the higher tier of sheet coils, and then we're going to want to do this for everything that we have access to. So we can do it with copper for better copper wires and better copper sheet coils. And this is the end of the copper processing chain. It's always nice to finish things off like that. Lead is similar. Tin is similar as well, and we have the option of making the tinned wire coils, which we already are, so we might as well upgrade to the better type. And let's see. These alloys don't currently have a coil version, and I haven't installed any mods to add them yet, so for now they will just stay as they are. Looks like we have solder that we need to process. And we do have a better tier of this, where now we have the option of adding silver to make the solder, which is interesting that it no longer will require any lead at all. And we'll just have logic to figure out which one works. And you might think that, why would we want to use silver for this when it's a harder to create resource? It's like, well, it all depends on how much you have. Like in this situation, we actually have a lot of silver. So we would actually want to use silver over lead, at least at this very moment. So we will need logic for all of that. And the same coolant recipe to improve the output a little bit. Let's see, next one is glass. And we're already doing the good way that the next tier above this gets more complicated, and it is purple science. So we'll save that for later because we can't research it right now. And then we have silicon, which I guess we are done on research slots here. So we'll research that in a bit when we have some space. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we are going to work with the crafting combinator mod and set up these crystallizers. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.